Peter Tobin, the Bible John killer. Peter Tobin is a man who etched his name in the history of the United Kingdom as one of the most dangerous serial killers. This man traveled across the country and used about 40 aliases to avoid detection of his previous crimes. He was convicted of killing 3 women across the UK and attacking 2 teenage girls. He was arrested at the age of 60, and the authorities' greatest fear was the possibility that he had been killing for over 40 years, which meant there could be many undiscovered deaths. Peter Tobin's crimes. In 1993, Peter Tobin attacked 2 14-year-old girls after luring them to his apartment in Hampshire. He drugged and raped them, and before leaving the apartment, he stabbed one of them, opened the gas, and locked them inside before fleeing to Coventry. Fortunately, the girls survived, and the police were able to identify the attacker. After being found, he confessed to his crime against the teenagers and served 10 years in prison. After his release in 2004, at the age of 58, he returned to Scotland and settled in Paisley. He had no shelter there, so he frequented the church table in Glasgow until he became one of the workers there under a false name, Pat McLaughlin. There, he met 23-year-old Polish student Angelica, who lived next door to the church. On September 24, 2006, Angelica disappeared, and 5 days later, her body was found under the floorboards of St. Patrick's Church. During investigations, witnesses confirmed seeing her alive for the last time with Pat McLaughlin, who fled the area again. The police tracked him down, and with strong forensic evidence against him, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. It is worth noting that Angelica died a violent death. She was beaten, raped, tied up, and stabbed 19 times before being buried alive under the floorboards. Peter's violent past. Psychologists and criminologists confirmed after studying Angelica's murder that it was not Peter Tobin's first crime. All evidence indicated that he was experienced in this type of crime. It is very rare for a middle-aged man to suddenly commit a brutal murder. This type of advanced behavior usually starts in late adolescence to early 20s, meaning he had been killing brutally for nearly 40 years. Based on what the scientists said, the police reviewed Peter's past and compared his crime to other similar and unsolved crimes in the UK. The investigations led to the discovery of other crimes, including the bodies of 2 teenage girls killed by Peter Tobin and buried in the backyard of his former home. The investigation into the disappearance of Vicky Hamilton in 1991 was also reopened. She was 15 years old at the time and was last seen in West Lothian, waiting for a bus less than a mile from Peter's house. After her disappearance, Peter immediately left the area and moved to Margate in Kent. When the police searched his house in Margate years later, they found Vicky Hamilton's remains buried in the backyard, indicating he had taken parts of her body with him when he left the area. A knife used to kill Vicky was also found, and based on this new evidence, he was charged with murder again and sentenced to life imprisonment. In 2007, a second body was found in Peter's backyard in Margate. Tests confirmed it was the body of 18-year-old Dinah McNichol, who went missing in August 1991 after attending a music festival. She was found to have been killed after Vicky Hamilton, and traces of the drug amitriptyline were found in her remains, the same drug Peter used in the 1993 attack on the 2 girls. In 2009, Peter was tried for Dinah's murder and was convicted in just 15 minutes, receiving a life sentence with a recommendation never to release him. The judge told Peter, "Once again, you have shown yourself unfit to live in a decent society. It is hard for me to convey the depth of hatred and disgust people feel for what you have done." Peter's ex-wife was one of his victims. He once stabbed her and left her to die, but she managed to seek help and later came to court to testify against him. In 2010, a woman named Patricia came to the police, claiming she had been assaulted and raped in Glasgow in 1968 when she was 15 years old. Patricia said she met a man at the Barrowland Ballroom in Glasgow who introduced himself as Jim McLaughlin. At the end of the evening, he asked her for another date, but she refused and left. In 2007, a second body was found in the garden of Peter's house in Margate. Tests confirmed that it was the body of 18-year-old Dinah McNichol, who went out one day in August 1991 to attend a concert and never returned. It was found that she was killed after Vicky Hamilton, and traces of the drug amitriptyline were discovered in her remains, the same drug Peter used in the attack on the two girls in 1993. In 2009, Peter was tried for the murder of Dinah, and in just 15 minutes, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation never to release him. Once again, you have shown yourself unfit to live in a decent society. It is hard for me to convey the extent of the hatred and disgust people feel towards what you have done, the judge told Peter. Peter's ex-wife was one of his victims. He stabbed her once and left her to die, but she managed to call for help and came to court years later to testify against him. In 2010, a woman named Patricia came to the police station claiming she was assaulted and raped in Glasgow in 1968 when she was 15 years old. Patricia said she met a man at the Barrowland nightclub in Glasgow who introduced himself as Jim McLaughlin. At the end of the evening, he asked her for another date, but she refused and left. Jim followed her and attacked her in a deserted street, raped her and nearly killed her, but she fought him off, and he fled before anyone came to her screams. That night, Patricia survived, but the battle left scars on her face. Patricia was sure that Peter was the one who attacked her, and that she was his first victim. However, this time, the charge against Peter was not proven due to a lack of strong evidence against him, even with the name McLaughlin, which Peter had used more than once in the past. This was the last case brought against Peter, despite his boasting in prison in front of inmates that he had killed 48 girls. Peter is currently serving a life sentence with 3 recommendations never to release him under any circumstances. Peter Tobin's victims from right to left: Dinah McNichol, 18 years old Angelica Cluck, 23 years old Vicky Hamilton, 15 years old. Bible John, a nickname given to a killer who committed brutal crimes in the Glasgow area between 1968 and 1969, but his identity was never known. This nickname was based on the description given by the sister of one of his victims, who said he was a well-dressed, polite, articulate young man about 25 years old, tall, thin, with red hair. She said he introduced himself as John Templeton and was religious, quoting the Bible frequently during their conversation and telling her he did not drink alcohol and prayed, which led her to call him Bible John. It is believed that his first victim was Patricia, a 25-year-old nurse. On the day of her murder in February 1968, she went out with her friend to the Barrowland nightclub to have some fun, but never returned that night. The next morning, her body was found by workers on their way to work. When found, she was naked, and her clothes and handbag were never found by the police. A year and a half after that incident, John killed Jemima McDonald, 32 years old, who had gone out to spend her evening at Barrowland and never returned. Her body was later found by her sister, who became worried when she heard neighborhood children talking about a body found in an abandoned house, killed in the same way Patricia was. It was indeed the body her sister had heard about. An examination revealed she had been severely beaten before being strangled. Like her predecessor, her clothes and belongings were also missing. Just 2 months later, 29-year-old Helen was spending the evening with her sister in the East End of Glasgow in October 1969. They met 2 men that night and left together in a taxi. Helen's sister got out of the taxi in front of her house and waved to Helen, saying she would see her tomorrow. But Helen never made it home, and her body was found the next morning, killed in the same way as Patricia and Jemima. Her killer was John. John's victims from right to left: Helen Puduk, 29 years old, Jemima McDonald, 32 years old, Patricia Docker, 25 years old. Hypotheses about John's true identity. One theory proposed was that John was a police officer on duty at the time of John's crimes. According to the book Dancing with the Devil by retired police officer Paul Harrison, evidence pointed to a Glasgow police officer who fled and disappeared for no known reason, but investigations in this direction were halted by sovereign orders. Paul Harrison, the author of the book, was one of the most skilled police officers in the United Kingdom. Important information in his book includes the testimony of Helen's sister, the last victim of Bible John, who was certain that the man she met that night and with whom her sister left was a police officer. The evidence that Paul considered decisive was the testimony of nightclub workers who confirmed, after seeing the accused officer's ID card, that he was the same person who was sitting with the last victim and her sister. They said he was a regular at the club, so they remembered his face well. But as mentioned earlier, the investigations into Bible John's true identity stopped at that time. However, many years later, Peter Tobin emerged. Based on the testimony of criminologists, psychologists, and Patricia's complaint, the police came up with circumstantial evidence all pointing to Peter being Bible John. In an attempt to prove this hypothesis, the police enlisted Officer Joe Jackson, who was in charge of the Bible John case years ago. Joe confirmed that there were indeed connections between Peter and Bible John that were hard to dismiss as mere coincidences, such as Peter meeting his wife at the Barrowland nightclub, the same club where Bible John found his victims. Photos of Peter as a young man at 21, closely resembling the police sketches of Bible John, based on eyewitness descriptions. Peter keeping souvenirs from his victims, just as Bible John did. Bible John's crimes began in the Glasgow area at the same time Peter moved there, and the crimes stopped during the years Peter was in prison for forgery and theft. From right to left, a photo of Peter Tobin at 60 years old, Peter at 27 years old, and a sketch of the killer known as Bible John. However, criminology professor David Wilson, who studied the crimes of both Peter and Bible John and wrote a book about them, had a different opinion. In his book, he mentioned that while there were clear similarities between Peter and Bible John, there were also differences. He refuted the evidence of similarity between Peter's photos and the description given by one of the victim's sisters, saying that this might indicate Peter committed the last crime, but not necessarily the previous two. He also said that it was almost impossible to be certain and suggested the possibility of two killers, one nicknamed Bible John and the other Peter, who might have been imitating Bible John out of admiration or to frame him. To this day, the true number of Bible John's victims and Peter's victims remains unknown, and whether Peter is the serial killer Bible John is still uncertain. Despite more than 40 years passing, the evidence linking the two killers remains circumstantial and inconclusive. Only one person can answer all these questions, and that is Peter Tobin, who has chosen to remain silent forever.